In 1965, Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia. Not a peaceful separation, not independence by choice, expelled. Lee Kuan Yew, the country's first prime minister, cried on television. He had no natural resources, no hinterland, no army to speak of. 2 million people, crammed onto an island smaller than New York City, surrounded by much larger neighbors who didn't particularly like them. 60 years later, the average Singaporean is wealthier than the average American, British, or Japanese citizen. What happened in between isn't a miracle. It's something far more calculated.
Here's the uncomfortable part. Singapore shouldn't work. It imports almost everything. Water from Malaysia, food from everywhere, energy, sand, even the soil under some of its buildings. The island has no oil, no arable land worth mentioning, nothing to dig up and sell. And yet, it's one of the richest countries on Earth, not just in Asia, on Earth. The per capita GDP sits above $70,000. Its sovereign wealth funds control over $1 trillion in assets. The government runs budget surpluses while building world-class infrastructure. It has zero public debt and foreign reserves that could fund the entire country for years without a single tax dollar. This isn't luck. It's not even just good policy. It's a system so deliberate, so tightly designed, that it makes other countries look like they're governing with a blindfold on. But there's a cost, and it's not the one most people think.
Let's start with the thing that should have killed Singapore: location. The island sits at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, right where the Indian Ocean meets the South China Sea. If you want to move anything between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, you pass through the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping choke points on the planet. Singapore is the doorman. In the 1960s, Lee Kuan Yew realized something. His country had no resources, but it had position. So he turned the port into a machine. He made it the most efficient, least corrupt, fastest port in the region. Ships could dock, unload, reload, and leave in hours instead of days. No bribes, no bureaucracy, just speed. Competitors like Jakarta and Manila were bigger, but they were slow, expensive, and unpredictable. Singapore was none of those things. By the 1980s, it wasn't just a port. It was the port. 30% of the world's shipping traffic passed through. Container volumes exploded. The entire economy began to reorganize around the idea of being a node, a hub, a place things moved through, rather than a place things stayed. But ports don't make you rich. Ports make you useful. Lee needed more.
In the 1970s, while the rest of Asia was still figuring out industrialization, Singapore made a different bet. It turned itself into a tax shelter. Not officially. Officially, it was about attracting multinational corporations and fostering a business-friendly environment. But the mechanics were clear. Corporate tax rate, 17%, one of the lowest in the developed world. No capital gains tax, no inheritance tax, tax exemptions for foreign income, treaties with dozens of countries to avoid double taxation. If you were a Western company doing business in Asia, or an Asian company doing business globally, Singapore became your mailbox, your regional headquarters, your intellectual property warehouse. Apple, Google, Facebook, the big oil firms, pharmaceutical giants, they all planted flags, not because they loved the weather, because the tax math worked. And Singapore didn't just take the money and run. It used those corporate dollars to fund infrastructure, education, housing. It became a place where the trains actually ran on time, where corruption was nearly extinct, where contracts meant something. The rule of law wasn't a slogan, it was the product. Companies stayed because the system worked, and the system worked because companies stayed. But here's the tension. Singapore's wealth isn't really Singaporean. It's passing through. The corporations, the assets, the capital, they're parked there, managed there, counted there, but they don't belong there. Now we get to the part the government doesn't like talking about. Singapore has two massive sovereign wealth funds, GIC and Temasek. Together, they manage over $1 trillion. That's more than the GDP of most countries. Where did that money come from? The official answer is prudent savings, budget surpluses, returns on investment. The real answer is more complicated. A huge chunk comes from something called the Central Provident Fund. It's a mandatory saving system. Every Singaporean worker contributes up to 20% of their salary. Employers match it. The money sits in individual accounts, but the government controls it. You can't withdraw it except for housing, healthcare, education, or retirement. The CPF takes in billions every year. And what does the government do with it? It invests through GIC at returns the public rarely sees detailed reports on. So Singaporeans are forced to save. The government invests that savings globally, and the profits help fund the country's operations. It's elegant, it's opaque, and it works. Temasek is different. It started as a holding company for state-owned enterprises, Singapore Airlines, the telecom providers, the court operator. Over time, it became a global investment fund. Today, it owns stakes in Alibaba, BlackRock, Airbus, and hundreds of other firms. The returns are public. The strategy is not. This is how a country with no resources builds a war chest. It turns its people into a capital base, and it deploys that capital with the discipline of a hedge fund.
Here's where it gets strange. Singapore has one of the highest costs of living in the world. Rent is brutal. A car costs 6 figures because the government limits vehicle ownership. Childcare is expensive. Aging parents are expensive. Everything is expensive. But the country is rich. The sovereign funds are overflowing. The reserves could cover government spending for a decade. So why doesn't the money flow back? The official answer is discipline. You don't spend reserves. You don't dip into the future to pay for the present. That's how countries go broke. The uncomfortable answer is control. The system works because the government holds the leverage. It owns the land, it builds the housing, it runs the healthcare, it controls wages through tripartite councils, it sets immigration policy to fill labor gaps.
There's no welfare state in the traditional sense. There's a management state, and it's incredibly effective. Unemployment is low, crime is almost non-existent, the streets are clean, the schools are world-class, and corruption is a career-ending risk. But the model doesn't export well. Other countries have tried. They built ports, cut taxes, launched sovereign funds, and most of them failed. Because Singapore's wealth isn't just about policy, it's about execution, and execution requires a level of state capacity most governments simply don't have. Let's zoom out. Singapore got rich by being small, disciplined, and ruthlessly pragmatic. It had no ideology beyond survival. It copied the best ideas from everywhere. British legal systems, American capitalism, Scandinavian urban planning, Chinese long-term thinking. It didn't care where the ideas came from. It cared whether they worked. But there's a darker read. Singapore is an authoritarian success story, not a dictatorship, but not a full democracy either. The same party has ruled since independence. The press is tightly managed. Protests are illegal without permits. Dissent is tolerated only up to a point. The trade-off is clear. Freedom for efficiency. Voice for wealth.
And for decades, most Singaporeans accepted it. The system delivered. Incomes rose. Housing was affordable through public schemes. Healthcare worked. Retirement was secure. But the younger generation is starting to ask different questions. Is wealth enough? Is stability enough? What happens when the global tax landscape changes and the corporate money moves elsewhere? What happens when automation replaces the foreign workers who do the jobs locals won't? What happens when China and India build their own Singapores? The model worked because Singapore was early and disciplined, but first mover advantage doesn't last forever.
And for decades, most Singaporeans accepted it. The system delivered. Incomes rose, housing was affordable through public schemes, healthcare worked, retirement was secure. But the younger generation is starting to ask different questions. Is wealth enough? Is stability enough? What happens when the global tax landscape changes and the corporate money moves elsewhere? What happens when automation replaces the foreign workers who do the jobs locals won't? What happens when China and India build their own Singapores? The model worked because Singapore was early and disciplined. But first mover advantage doesn't last forever. Singapore became crazy rich by rejecting the idea that small countries are powerless. It weaponized geography. It built systems other governments were too corrupt or too chaotic to build. It saved when others spent. It planned in decades when others planned in election cycles. But the wealth is fragile in ways that don't show up on a balance sheet. It depends on global trade staying open, on tax treaties staying favorable, on the city-state remaining more efficient than its competitors, on citizens continuing to accept a model where the government manages almost everything. There's no manual for what happens when those conditions change. Singapore didn't become rich by accident. It became rich by turning constraints into advantages and weaknesses into weapons. The question now isn't whether the model works. It's whether it can survive success.